Right now, your savings, your mortgage rate, and even like the price of your groceries, they're all being subsidized by this one totally invisible global assumption.
Mm-hmm.
And that assumption is that the US dollar is completely untouchable.
Mm.
Because, if you live inside the bubble of a dominant global superpower, permanence just feels like a given. It feels like this natural law of the universe.
Right, absolutely. It does.
But history, I mean, spanning from the Dutch to the British and all the way back to the Romans, it tells us a terrifyingly consistent truth.
Hmm.
Every single superpower operates on a strict expiration date.
Yeah.
And mathematically, America's timer is currently blinking red.
Yeah, it is a profoundly uncomfortable realization because when you are standing in the absolute center of the empire, you suffer from this illusion of permanence.
Right.
You literally cannot fathom a world where your currency or your military or your culture aren't just the default center of the universe.
Which is exactly why we are doing this deep dive today. We're going to explore a really fascinating document that unpacks investor Ray Dalio's big cycle framework. It's called 500 Years of Empires Dying the Same Way Is America Next.
Yeah, it's a phenomenal piece of work.
It really is.
Yeah.
Dalio essentially maps out the exact mechanics of how empires rise, how they peak, and inevitably, how they fracture and fall. And our mission today is to use this to figure out where the world is actually heading next.
Exactly.
Because to me, an empire in decline, it's kind of like, it's like a seemingly indestructible skyscraper.
Right.
We're so used to it dominating the skyline that we completely ignore the foundational cracks spreading through the basement. Or, it's like an aging tech giant.
Oh, that's a good comparison.
Right. Like they used to be this scrappy startup risking everything on R&D.
Yeah.
But now they're just this bloated monopoly. They've stopped inventing new things, and they spend all their revenue just like buying back their own stock and fighting internal HR battles.
Yeah.
And they are completely blind to the fact that some startup in a garage somewhere is quietly building the exact technology that will make them obsolete.
That is the perfect modern lens for this. Because, when that bloated monopoly finally collapses, people always scramble to find a really simple scapegoat.
Sure. They want to blame one guy.
Right. They want to blame a specific CEO or just bad luck or like one disastrous policy decision. But what Dalio's framework proves is that the rise and fall of empires isn't about bad luck at all.
It's math.
It is a deeply systematic, almost mathematical process. It's this unbending cyclical engine that's really just driven by human nature. And, well, the terror of a mathematical process is that it doesn't care about your feelings or your patriotism or anything like that.
Yeah.
But the beauty of it is that once we understand the formula, we can actually position ourselves for the future.
Well, let's get straight into that formula then. The blueprint of history. Because, before we can diagnose the current state of America, we really have to understand the lifespan of these empires. And looking at these sources, the timeline that Dalio lays out is shockingly precise.
It really is. When you study the life cycle of the Dutch Empire, and then you look at the British Empire, and now the American Empire, they all follow this incredibly strict window. From their explosive emergence as a global power up to their absolute peak and then into their terminal decline, that window is roughly 200 to 250 years.
Wait, 250 years? I mean, in the grand scheme of human civilization, that is literally a blip.
Yeah.
So I have to ask the obvious question here. Why? Is these historical cycles just like a self-fulfilling prophecy? Is it just the geopolitical equivalent of gravity where what goes up must inevitably come down?
Well, no, it's not some magical calendar date where everyone just gives up. The reason the window is strictly 200 to 250 years is because that represents roughly 3 to 4 human generations.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, it is basically the biological limit of human memory.
That is fascinating. Break that down for me a bit more.
Think about it mechanically. Generation 1 builds the empire. They go through immense trauma, usually a massive conflict or crisis. And so they have this desperate, relentless work ethic.
Right, survival mode.
Exactly. Then Generation 2 maintains and expands that empire. They still remember the sacrifices of their parents. But then Generation 3 inherits the empire at its absolute peak, having never intimately known the struggle required to build it in the first place.
So they get comfortable.
Very. They optimize for leisure and comfort, so by the time you hit Generation 4, the citizens have absolutely zero institutional memory of what it takes to build a resilient society. They only know how to consume it.
Wow. So the cycle is really just human biology reacting to shifting economic incentives. The generation that builds the wealth, essentially creates the exact conditions that spoil the generation that inherits it.
Precisely. And Dalio doesn't just use this generational theory as a vague vibe. He actually tracks it with 8 measurable indicators.
Right, I saw that. So he looks at, let me make sure I have these: education quality, innovation in tech, global market performance, share of global trade, military capacity, financial sector power, and then finally, currency dominance.
You got it.
But reading through the sources, it doesn't seem like he's just listing these 8 metrics on a dashboard. They operate much more like a sequential chain reaction, right? Like a domino effect.
That is the absolute critical insight of the whole framework. It's a causal chain. You don't just, magically get a reserve currency one day.
Right.
First, you invest heavily in education. That highly educated workforce naturally leads to massive innovation and technological breakthroughs. And because you have the best tech, you capture a massive share of global trade.
And then you have to protect that trade.
Exactly. To protect those global trade routes, you were forced to build a dominant military. And when the rest of the world sees that your economy is innovating, your trade is secure, and your military is unmatched, well, they naturally trust your financial sector.
So they adopt your currency.
Right. The indicators essentially push each other upward along this massive bell curve.
Which means the logical place for us to start is at the bottom of that curve, the ascent. Because an empire doesn't just spontaneously generate that kind of momentum on a lazy Tuesday. To kick off that very first domino education, you need a catalyst.
And historically speaking, that catalyst is almost always a brutal existential crisis, like a major war or a total systemic collapse.
Something that forces change.
Yes, the old stagnant status quo has to be entirely broken so that the society is literally forced to evolve. Under extreme pressure, strong leaders emerge out of pure necessity to overhaul broken institutions and rapidly modernize.
The sources actually bring up Japan in the late 19th century as an example of this, and it perfectly illustrates the point. You had this insular feudal society where all the power and wealth were locked up by local lords. It was this stagnant system that just totally resisted change. But then, when faced with the threat of Western colonial powers swallowing them whole, Japan didn't just, tweak their tax policy.
No, they tore it all down.
Exactly. They engaged in a radical systemic teardown. They systematically built modern institutions. They poured capital into a world-class education system, and they constructed an industrial base from absolute scratch.
And the result was staggering. I mean, within just a few decades, they went from a technologically backward feudal state to a formidable modern industrial powerhouse that was fully capable of challenging global empires.
And America's rise follows that exact same mechanical blueprint, doesn't it? The catalyst was the Civil War. I mean, the ultimate internal crisis.
Yeah.
Following that, the United States didn't just patch up the old agrarian economy. The country hyper-prioritized public education, basic literacy, and specialized skill development. We built research universities and land-grant colleges.
Which is so important.
Yeah, America became a knowledge powerhouse way before it became a military powerhouse. And that intellectual foundation is really what allowed the U.S. to emerge from World War II as the undisputed global superpower.
Because true, sustainable strength always comes from those economic and educational fundamentals. You need the brain power to invent the machinery of the future. I mean, the British Empire did the exact same thing before the Americans.
Right.
Britain didn't conquer the globe just by sailing ships around for fun. Their rise was driven by genuine earth-shattering innovation during the Industrial Revolution. They invented the factory systems and the heavy machinery that made them the undisputed manufacturing hub of the entire planet.
And because they manufacture practically everything, the global supply chain ran straight through London. Which leads us to the absolute peak of the mountain.
Yeah.
Currency dominance. Global trade settled in the British pound sterling.
Yeah. And gaining that primary reserve currency status is, well, it's the ultimate prize in geopolitics. When the entire world uses your money to trade with each other, even when you, as a nation, aren't involved in the transaction at all, it gives you this exorbitant, almost unfair mathematical privilege.
Because it means you could just print debt that the rest of the world is basically forced to buy.
Precisely. It allows the empire to borrow money effortlessly, project immense global influence, and constantly fuel its own expansion without facing the immediate inflation that would completely crush a normal developing nation.
Wow.
Post-World War II, the U.S. dollar just inherited that exact exorbitant privilege from the British pound.
Okay, so the empire reaches the top of the curve. They have the tech, the military, the reserve currency. The good times are rolling. But Here is where the big cycle takes a pretty dark turn, and I actually want to push back on Dalio's framing here for a second.
Sure.
The sources say that this exact peak prosperity directly triggers the downfall. Dalio points to luxury, comfort, and a high standard of living as a fatal flaw, the rot phase. But isn't the entire point of building a thriving economy to give your citizens a better, more comfortable life?
It's a fair question.
It just feels like we're punishing an empire for successfully achieving its core goal. I mean, why is enjoying the fruits of your labor a fatal flaw?
It's a very natural pushback, but you have to separate the moral judgment from the mathematical reality here. Dalio isn't saying that enjoying the fruits of your labor is evil. He is pointing out the psychological shift that occurs, who he calls hubris.
Ah, okay.
It goes back to our generational timeline. The fatal flaw isn't the luxury itself. It's the fact that the culture shifts its entire focus from actually producing wealth to simply consuming it.
Oh, I see. It's the shift from the scrappy garage startup to the bloated tech giant.
Exactly. At the absolute peak, the citizens become complacent. The generations inheriting the wealth lose that relentless hunger and the risk tolerance that built the empire in the first place. You see this vividly when you look back at the Roman Empire.
Right.
Rome wasn't primarily hollowed out by outside attacks. It fell from within due to extreme luxury, decadence, and massive wealth gaps that just destroyed their social cohesion.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not just that they are living in luxury, it's about what happens to the society's work ethic.
Right. And more importantly, the fatal flaw is how that modern luxury is being funded.
Let's unpack the mechanics of that.
Yeah.
Because this is where the math gets genuinely terrifying for the modern era.
It really does. To sustain a hyper-consumerist lifestyle while simultaneously maintaining this massive, sprawling, global military footprint, an aging empire stops paying for things with productive innovation and starts paying for them with debt. America right now is completely drowning in borrowed money. Household debt is climbing, and the national debt constantly breaks historic records. History proves unequivocally that substituting debt for actual productivity eventually triggers severe financial instability.
Which the sources tied directly to the 2008 financial crisis. When you view 2008 through Dalio's timeline, it wasn't just like a weird glitch in the housing market or a couple of greedy bankers.
No, not at all.
It was the exact structural warning tremor you mathematically expect when an empire shifts from producing tangible value to simply financing its own decadence through massive complex leverage.
And what happens when an economy relies on financial engineering instead of real manufacturing? It dramatically expands economic inequality.
Right.
The financial elites get exponentially richer because they hold all the asset stocks, real estate, which are inflated by the central bank printing money just to keep the debt machine running. Meanwhile, the middle and lower classes are entirely hollowed out, their wages stagnate, and they drown in the rising cost of living.
Which brings us to the fracture of society. Because when you stretch the wealth gap that far, it inevitably snaps the social contract. And this is where the geopolitical framework really meets our daily news cycle.
Yes. Under the weight of that anger, resentment, and a total loss of trust in fundamental institutions, you create the perfect, predictable conditions for populist movements to rise.
And I want to pause here, because it's crucial to understand about Dalio's framework that it strips away political ideology entirely.
Completely.
When the sources discuss the rise of modern populism, specifically pointing to figures like Donald Trump or equivalent anti-establishment movements on the left, we have to be clear. We are taking absolutely zero political sides here.
Right. This isn't left-wing or right-wing commentary.
Exactly. We're strictly, impartially reporting how the original source material maps this. It views these movements purely as mathematical symptoms. They are the historical, structural immune responses of a society where economic inequality has pushed the working class to the breaking point.
That objective neutrality is essential to grasping the big cycle. In the late stages of every empire, populist movements emerge. They are built to capitalize on these exact dynamics. They channel the widespread frustration, they attack the entrenched establishment, and they promise a radical redistribution of wealth or power. It is a completely predictable symptom of a late-stage empire turning inward.
Because the elite at the top, historically speaking, they never willingly surrender their privileges or their wealth, do they?
They never do. And that gridlock leads to severe social unrest, constant protests, and extreme political polarization. The entire energy of the nation, which used to be focused outward on innovation and global expansion, gets entirely consumed by domestic survival.
So the empire spends all its time fighting itself over a shrinking pie.
Exactly.
But here's the mathematical trap of a distracted empire.
Mm.
Physics abhors a vacuum. The exact moment a dominant power turns its attention inward to fight over domestic wealth, it pulls its energy away from global innovation, which leaves this massive undefended void. Which brings us to the challengers. Because while the reigning empire is distracted, fighting itself, what is happening outside its borders?
Well, competitors don't just sit around watching the dominant empire fracture. They actively step into that void. They quietly study and adapt the leading empire's models. And China is the undeniable prime example in the current cycle.
Right.
They adopted Western economic and technological frameworks and used them to build the world's second-largest economy at just a breathtaking pace. Just look at the trajectory. In 2003, China represented barely 4% of the global GDP. By 2026, they are projected to represent roughly 16 to 17%.
And they aren't just passively growing, they are executing these really aggressive structural catch-up strategies. The sources highlight the Belt and Road Initiative. And this isn't just a handful of random construction projects, is it?
No, it's a sweeping infrastructure program spanning over 140 countries. It's fundamentally designed to physically wire the global supply chain to run through Beijing. If the roads, the ports, and the digital cables all lead to China, the U.S. loses its ability to economically isolate them.
Add to that their aggressive technological push. They are building outright dominance through state-backed companies like Huawei, aggressively expanding their footprint in 5G telecommunications, artificial intelligence, and the global electric vehicle supply chain.
They are trying to capture the foundational technologies of the next century.
But let's maintain some perspective here, because the American skyscraper isn't collapsing into dust tomorrow morning.
Definitely not.
The U.S. still has massive, enduring structural strengths. I mean, as recently as 2023, the top 10 global technology corporations were all American. The U.S. military's ability to project power across multiple oceans remains completely unmatched. And crucially, the U.S. dollar still holds roughly 60% of all global foreign exchange reserves. The world still fundamentally trades in dollars.
The steel frame is absolutely still holding up, and it's equally important to note that China faces incredibly serious foundational cracks of its own.
Right, they have major headwinds.
Exactly. They are dealing with a rapidly aging population, a demographic time bomb, really, where fewer young workers have to support a massive elderly population. That destroys a debt-based growth model.
Plus the real estate issues.
Yes. They have a sprawling domestic real estate crisis, skyrocketing levels of internal debt, and intensifying geopolitical blowback from Western nations. So China is a formidable challenger, but it is not an unstoppable machine.
And it's no longer just a two-player board game anyway. The framework notes the rise of other major power blocks stepping into the fray. India has surpassed China in population and has a rapidly expanding, highly educated tech sector. The European Union remains a massive regulatory and economic weight. And developing nations across the global south are really asserting themselves, basically refusing to just pick a side between Washington and Beijing.
Exactly. The board is getting complicated.
But based on the historical blueprint, I have to ask a difficult question. Does a terminal decline always end in a kinetic world war? Or, in our modern, hyper-connected era, can this cycle just culminate in a clumsy, tense passing of the baton?
Well, the historical precedent is incredibly sobering on that front. The text emphasizes that when a reigning nation's attention shifts inward due to domestic crumbling, it naturally gives competitors the space to expand their spheres of influence.
Right.
Eventually, those expanding spheres collide. And historically, this leads to direct military confrontations or massive structural clashes, the exact kind of friction that produces world wars. A polite, peaceful passing of the baton is a historical anomaly.
Man. And making this even more volatile is the fact that this rivalry isn't just playing out on traditional battlefields or shipping lanes. The sources identify three massive, unprecedented wildcards that are acting as accelerants to this specific cycle.
Yes.
It's like pouring gasoline onto the big cycle. I mean, it took the British 250 years to cycle through, but these wildcards might put the current geopolitical shift on fast forward.
They absolutely will. The framework outlines three major structural forces rewriting the rules of the game, and we have to understand how they disrupt the cycle. The first is artificial intelligence and automation.
Which is everywhere right now.
Right. Macroeconomic projections suggest AI could inject trillions of dollars into global GDP by 2030. But mechanically, AI changes the math of productivity. It completely circumvents the traditional labor advantages of developing nations and reshuffles the deck for whichever whichever nation masters the algorithms first.
Wow. And the second wild card is the rise of digital assets. We were talking about decentralized cryptocurrencies and central bank digital currencies. By 2021, they had already scaled to multiple trillions of dollars in value, proving they're a serious force.
Exactly.
And the mechanism here is crucial. The entire foundation of American empire dominance is the U.S. dollar's reserve status, which is enforced by the traditional banking system. Crypto and foreign digital currencies are actively building an alternative plumbing system for global finance. If nations can trade instantly without touching the U.S. banking system, the United States loses its superpower ability to sanction its enemies or print endless debt.
It completely neutralizes the exorbitant privilege.
And what's the third wild card?
The third structural wild card is climate change. Billions of dollars are currently flowing into renewable energy infrastructure. This creates immense mechanical pressure on the global economy.
Right.
Fossil fuel-dependent economies, like the major oil states, are forced to completely reinvent their national models or face collapse. Furthermore, the physical threat of rising sea levels means coastal cities face serious financial and physical inundation risks. This strands massive amounts of real estate assets, making climate resilience both a strict survival necessity and a massive geopolitical advantage.
So we have the historical cycle, driven by debt and generational complacency, now being strapped to the rocket engines of AI, decentralized finance, and climate disruption.
It accelerates the timeline dramatically.
So what does this all mean for you, listening right now? If you recognize that this cycle is real, that the dominoes are falling, and that the geopolitical shifts are happening in real time, what are you actually supposed to do with this information?
Well, Dalio's ultimate conclusion, synthesizing all of these historical, geopolitical, and technological forces, is that relying on the status quo is the most dangerous risk you can take.
Makes sense.
Because the big cycle repeats systematically and without any sentiment, relying on a single asset class, a single fiat currency, or the stability of a single nation leaves you completely vulnerable to a total wipeout when the cycle turns.
Right.
The only rational mathematical response is radical diversification. You have to diversify across different sectors, different asset classes, and entirely different geographic regions.
You cannot bet your entire life savings, your career, and your family's future on the skyscraper never falling simply because it's dominated the skyline for your entire life.
Precisely. History operates on an unbending engine. Every superpower eventually falls, and the transition is always volatile. Aligning your understanding of the world with that relentless momentum isn't optional. It's the fundamental requirement for surviving the shift.
Which brings us right back to where we started, that dangerous, invisible illusion of permanence. I want to leave you with one final, chilling thought to mull over when you look at your portfolio, or your career trajectory, or your savings account. Look closely at the foundation of your daily life right now. If the U.S. dollar were to lose its reserve status tomorrow and the global financial plumbing was suddenly rerouted, how much of your personal reality is entirely dependent on that one single currency remaining invincible?